Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started tonight. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's Veritas Forum. We are so glad to have you all here for this. My name is Sydney. I'm a second-year political science major in the college, and I get the opportunity to be your student MC for tonight's forum. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I want to briefly explain what the Veritas Forum is for those of you who may not have attended a Veritas event before. Veritas was founded in 1992 by some students and chaplains at Harvard to invite members of the university community to seek truth together. Veritas aims to create spaces where we can put the Christian faith in dialogue with pressing issues in the world so that we can navigate through life's hardest questions and explore our deepest beliefs together as part of an ongoing dialogue. Tonight, we will have a moderator who will dialogue with our speaker, Dr. Willie Jennings. Following the speaker portion of tonight's forum, we will be having a time of Q&A, which will be managed through Slido. We'll go ahead and put the link to the Slido in the chat again for you guys. And we encourage you all to use that to submit any questions you have throughout the evening so we can include them in the Q&A portion that will be at the end. Currently, UChicago is doing a series of forums in 2021 around the theme, Wholeness Beyond What Fractures. The focus of tonight's conversation is Among the Fragments, Race and the Fragile Hope of Wholeness in America. This topic has become more relevant and pressing in the last few years, but of course has been an issue throughout the history of America. I know as a student at UChicago, I am continually working through the complexities of our university's relationship with the Black communities of the South Side. Those of us living in Hyde Park know our university's history of gentrification and policing of the South Side. And I think by living in this neighborhood, it becomes very clear very quickly that racism is not a subtle thing, but is pervasive and intrusive and systemic in Black people and minorities' lives. I think inhabiting this complex situation is an opportunity that is hard to bear because of the pain that it's inflicted, but also one that requires us to have informed and continually developing understandings of race. And I believe tonight's conversation is going to be a part of that development of our understanding. So I'm really excited to get into that. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight's forum, Matthew Vega. Matthew is a PhD student and library fellow at the University of Chicago, where he studies theology, race, and class. He is the co-author of a forthcoming chapter in the Theology and Pop Culture series put out by Fortress Academic and Lexington Books. His chapter compares the emergence of Black theology in the 1960s with the emergence of the Miles Morales Spider-Man. Matt, we're very excited to have you here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you so you can get us started.
Thank you, Sydney, and good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all. I recognize a number of the names that show up on the attendees list, and I'm so thankful to be alive and in conversation with my dear brother, Dr. Willie Jennings. I'm so thankful for all of the organizers here, way too many to name, and I would belabor my gratitude and keep you here all night if I did that. I'm gonna introduce Dr. Jennings in a moment. But before I do that, I want to situate our host selves in this conversation. The title is Race and the Fragile Hope of Wholeness. So we're going to be talking tonight about race. And I think it's important to register the anxieties that people are coming here with. Anxieties that have been intensified in our bodies in the past couple of weeks as we have been bombarded with reminders of the often deadly significance of race and white supremacy in particular. And we've been in such a short period of time, we've seen how it's cut across racial and generational boundaries. Our Asian kin, our Latina kin, our Black kin, babies, adults, we've seen all of this in the past couple of weeks. And so I want to name that because what Dr. Jennings writes and teaches about is a matter of life and death. And so having him here is so timely. And for those of you who don't know Dr. Jennings, He teaches systematic theology and Africana studies at Yale Divinity School. He is the author of The Christian Imagination, Acts, and his most recent book, After Whiteness and Education and Belonging. Dr. Jennings is both a historian and a theologian who has done a good deal of work around race and theology. And more importantly, he is a good man. I've had the gift of sharing digital space with Dr. Jennings over the last year many, many times, and I'm always grateful to learn something new from him. And I'm grateful that we all get to learn from him tonight because he has so much to teach us. And so, my dear brother, Dr. Jennings, I want to start our conversation with a big, broad question to situate our conversation. What exactly is this thing we call race? And how do your lenses of theology and history inform your understanding of race?
Man, thank you for that great starting question. And it's great to be here with you and to be a part of this Veritas Forum event. As always, it is a joy to do things with Veritas and to be in the presence of wonderful inquiring minds and students trying to make their way in through this world. Well, you're asking the crucial question, the first question, what is race? And in the West, it's a very difficult question because we're talking about a phenomena, an object, but we're also talking about a reality that we all swim in. And so to be able to talk about something that we want to imagine external to us, while also realizing the internal work, or should I say the contextual work that it does, is very difficult. Well, very briefly, race is a way of seeing the world, a distorted way of seeing the world. Within Christian thought, we might want to say that race is a distorted view of creation, a distorted view of the order of the body, of the order of the relationship between the body and land, and a distorted view of the kinds of relationality that should exist because of those views of body and land and the body itself. And it has a particular history. And this is what's so difficult for people to get their minds around. There was a time on this planet when no one would have imagined themselves encased in something called race. That's not to say that there were not always kind of elements that later on would coalesce into the racial imagination in terms of people identifying others differently from themselves, even springing off things like phenotype and bodily description. But the vision of race that we have is the creation of a perfect storm. And the difficulty for so many people is they don't understand the perfect storm that had to happen, or that should say did happen, that created race. The analogy would be like the mad scientist who mixes some things together completely by accident, and all of a sudden there it is. And in many ways, when we're talking about race, we're talking about something that in a fundamental way was inexplicable in its forming. And then when it formed, it created a way to explain itself and to explain the world. And so that's where we want to begin in thinking about these matters. Race is not, as I like to say, race is not fallen from heaven. It's not a part of biology. Race is not a part of creation, a part of the created order for those who are Christian listening. It is a particular historical emergence of a way of perceiving oneself and the world, and the dynamics that should organize that be organized from that reality of perception.
And so what what does this have to do with theology?
Mhm.
We tend to, because a lot of your work is exploring the relationship between race and the spiritual meanings of it. And so I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you could say a little bit more about what race
Sure.
has to do with theology.
Well, and this ties also into the question, the first good question you asked me here, and that is, what is race, and where does it come from? So, as I said a moment ago, race emerges from a perfect storm. And here's what we have to understand: the modern vision of race would not be possible without Christianity. So let me just say this to all the listeners so they can, it's a bit of a complicated statement, but I want people to think about this. There is inside of the modern racial condition, modern racial consciousness, there is a Christian architecture to it. This is what many people who study race, whether they are sociologists or historians or psychologists or anthropologists, many people who study race do not understand that there is a Christian architecture inside of modern racial reasoning and thinking. And also, there is a racial architecture inside of modern Christian existence. And that is so difficult for people that these things have now enfolded inside of each other. Now, how in the world can that be the case? Well, three things we have to put on the table to understand how this is so deeply tied to Christianity. The first brings us back to the very heart of Christianity, the very heart of the story that makes intelligible Christian life. And that story is simply this: that through a particular people called Israel, God brought the redemption of the world. And those people's story becomes the means within which we come to understand who God is and what God has done. Christianity is inside Israel's story. Now, at a certain point in time, as the people who began to believe that story were more than just the people of Israel, more than just Jews, these others called Gentiles began to believe that story. At some point in time, we don't have to pinpoint it because we're not sure where we can pinpoint it, but at some point in time, they got tired of being told that you were strangers brought into a different story, that you were outsiders brought in, that you were foreigners, this was not your story. You are here by grace. You are here because you have decided to follow one of our own that many of us don't think was right in the head. Many of us don't think that what Jesus said is true, but you do. But you are in our story now. At some point in time, Christians got sick of hearing that. And very early and very clearly, they started to push Israel out from its own story. That is to say, they narrated their Christian existence as if Israel did not exist as crucial to that story, just as backdrop. And so the idea that Israel was centered in its own story, like all people are centered in their own story, they pushed Israel out, and then these Christians centered themselves. By the time we come to what's known as the Middle Ages, by the medieval period, Christians have completely centered themselves in the story of redemption, the Christian story, to the extent that they actually call Israelites and Jewish people, they actually call them the heathens, the pagans, the Gentiles, and they are the people of God. They are the chosen. Now, that is already a profound distortion of Christianity, already a profound distortion. And so when we arrive at what the old language, the age of discovery, we arrive at the age of discovery, and they find themselves here on the cusp of what will become the colonial moment, the modern colonial moment of taking over, of seizing land. They are there believing that they are at the very center of what God wants to do in the world. They're at the very center of it. Because the way in which they read the Bible, the way in which they form their theologies, the way in which they teach, the way in which they carry out their Christian lives, they have centered themselves, and they believe that whatever God will do in this world will be through them and will be because of them. They are at the very heart of God's strategies of redemption, God's strategy of claiming all of creation back to God's self. Now, the reality that is the beginning. Now, in the new worlds, they realize their power over people, and they also realize the power of their perceptions over people. And you want to hold on to both of them. They realize their power, and they realize the power of their perceptions over people. That is, they have the power to transform the land, transform the configuration of the built environment, transform the landscape. But they also have the power to force people into a different perception of the world and of themselves. And it's precisely in that matrix of a centered European, what we call kind of proto-European, but soon to be called European, the power to transform the land and the landscape in the world, and the power to force perception, that racial categories, racial vision starts to emerge. Taken apart from all that, is such things as calling people white or black, that had floated around in the old world. That had floated around in many places. You know, seeing someone as, you know, talking about, you know, very differences in body type, skin color, and so forth. That had been there. It didn't come out of nowhere. But now inside this horrific matrix, it starts to harden. It starts to become a way, not simply of conjecture, but a way of defining not only indigenous peoples, but defining themselves. And so it is this centered existence, this ability to transform the land, take from it what you want, do with it what you want, and to define for everyone else what reality is, that constitutes whiteness. This is where whiteness begins. So let me come back to my statement. So unless you know that this is a Christian operation, and it rides in on the power of a Christian operation, you cannot grasp the absolute power of race to define existence, right? Now, even when people move beyond that Christian matrix, if you will, in terms of being able to explicitly articulate it and confess it and agree with it, they are still inside of it. And so what we have at this moment is we have a reality, we have a continuing reality of whiteness that very few people understand why it is so compelling and so powerful. Because it has this deep theological matrix working inside of it. It has this compelling sense of how one comes to make sense of one's world, organize one's world, and how one has the power and the right to organize your own world. So that's my definition of whiteness, in effect. Whiteness is a way of being in the world and a way of perceiving the world, a way of organizing and ordering the world by that perception. And whiteness is having the power to carry out that perception and to sustain it geographically, economically, physically.
That's the idea that the architecture, that there's a racial architecture inside of Christianity, and that Christianity is the architecture to modern conceptions of race, I think provides a really important backdrop for some of the main themes in your work, which intimacy, as I read your work, is a major theme, a theme that seems to be at the heart of the Christian message, which is confronted by these new definitions, these ways of in many ways severing our intimacy. And so I guess and that seems to be lost at the moment of what we euphemistically call contact or discovery. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about intimacy and this theme of intimacy and our connection to the earth and to others. Is the idea that we are somehow closer to the land and to each other when race is not involved?
This is a great question, Matt. The challenge for these colonialists when they came to the New World was twofold. One was trying to make sense of the vastness of the New World. The language I use is the epistemological, the ways of knowing, the epistemological density of the New World. Because what opens up is a world that they had only heretofore imagined existed. But here now they are seeing a world that's utterly breathtaking. Not only breathtaking in terms of the landscapes and the flora and the fauna and the mountains and the oceans and so forth, but the vast variety of peoples, all speaking different languages, the different ways of life. And the utter being overwhelmed by that reality. And then the desire to want to try to make sense of that. Why am I here? What does this mean? And the reality of having absolute power. I mean, coming to a place where in a short time that you can take what you want. And all of this having a distorting effect on their faith. And what do I mean by that? So if you, in the old world, if you've lived your whole life in what would amount to about 150-mile radius, and that's being very generous, maybe like a 60-mile radius. You've lived your whole life. You come to the New World, and the royalty of the old world, because of your faithful service, has given you 80,000 acres of land. And everything that's in it, it's all yours now. It's all yours because you've been such a wonderful, faithful servant. And here you are trying to make sense of who you are in this place. And so the relationship you have with God is already whatever kind of spiritual intimacy one imagines. We want to be careful not to read the kind of Protestant visions of spiritual intimacy back into these moments, but the Protestants do show up. But whatever vision of life you have with God now is shaped inside this unbelievable reality of power, of greed, and of control. And so one of the first things you do, and whether we're talking about the Portuguese or the Spanish or the French or the Dutch or the Germans later on, or the Americans, one of the first things you do is the way you look out on the land is precisely inside what I just said. You hear ringing in your ear. In one ear, the royalty of the old world, or the government officials of the old world have told you, thank you for the work you've done. This is all yours. And in this ear, you hear the Spirit of God, you think, saying to you, this is all yours, my son. And I say son because in most cases it was a man. All this is yours, my son. This is your, let's use the word, private property. This is yours. Now, the first thing you have to do is that you have to help all the people who happen to be on your land. You have to dispel them of notions that allow them to think that they are on any other place than your land. And the first thing you have to dispel is the idea that many of them had in different registers and in different ways, to be sure, but many of them had an idea that they were profoundly connected to the land. That is, their identities was not simply a matter of their arms and legs and their bodies and their phenotype and so forth and so on. Their identities were tied to the land, tied to the water, tied to the mountains, tied to particular configurations, tied to particular animals that were their kin. And so when you would ask them, and many of the accounts for missionaries say this, when you would ask them, who are you? Many indigenous peoples will start telling stories. And they're like, okay, thanks, but who are you? And they would continue to tell them a story. Because the story about life in the land was exactly who they were. Now, for the colonialists coming, that's nonsense. For the missionary colonialists, they also saw that as nonsense, but in many cases they saw that as demonically derived nonsense. The devil working on these people, in a sense, drawing them to some kind of nature worship of nature, of seeing themselves tied to it. And so they needed to dispel the idea and the ways of life that encircle that idea of being one with the land. Not a romantic idea that everything was wonderful and everything was easy, but there was profound connection to the land. And so part of what drives the formation of race, as I always say, and this is really important for everybody to understand, modern racial vision and modern vision of private property are two sides of the same coin. One does not come to exist in the new worlds without the other. They are two sides of the same coin. They had to extract people from the land and extract the land from people. That is, take the idea that somehow you are connected to the land. One piece of land is just as good as any other piece of land. And it's precisely that idea of pieces of land. So indigenous peoples, in order to even talk about being in a place, this comes back to the perception question, they were forced to articulate their being in a place in terms of private property. Now, there was an idea of possession, but possession as private property owned eternally by an individual that can then be sold at that person's whim, utterly foreign and profoundly destructive. So this is where the reality of intimacy starts to crumble. Now, let's add one more layer and then we can come on to another question, because this is crucial. So what happens for so many indigenous peoples, what happens for so many of those commodities the colonial Europeans brought with them, those commodities called slaves, what happened to so many indigenous peoples and to so many slaves is that as the colonialists are forming this new world, they are forcing an entire world inside their own intimate life. Think about it this way. Between indigenous servants who really don't want to be servants and Black slaves who definitely don't want to be slaves, both are being forced to service the white body, to care for its needs and its moods, to enter fully into its way, its forms of desire, its ways of loving, its ways of reaching out and touching God, its ways of thinking about God, its way of responding to God, and to negotiate that reality of intimacy with their own realities of intimacy. And so Christianity and the Western world forms inside this ongoing, complicated, and convoluted negotiation of white subjectivity, the inner life of whiteness. And for so many people, their Christianity is caught up yet inside those realities. So, and many people, as you know, over the many centuries, have both fought against it, both operated with it, and also redefined it while they were inside of it. But Christianity itself continues to have the unfinished work, the unfinished business of pulling itself from inside the reality of white intimacy, a Christianity, a spiritual life that is still so much defined by that white intimacy, that reality, that ruling imperial form of intimate life that defines what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble, what is honorable, and therefore, Matt, what is desirable. All of us have to go through the fiery brook of the redefinition of our desires away from whiteness. And for so many peoples, that fiery brook is too deep and too long to traverse. And so they are still caught in the midst of it.
And that's a really sobering picture, right? Because if so many of us are brought into this vision of intimacy that is indexed to our proximity to whiteness, in your most recent book, and After Whiteness, you give glimpses of possibilities of moving beyond this, and sometimes if I'm having a conversation with someone who, if we want to imagine worlds where this is not, where this way of relating to one another is not possible, how do you see having that sort of conversation that doesn't slide into viewing others in a sort of colorblind, post-racial way? Is it possible to move beyond race, or do we have to go through race? What are the terms for intimacy that aren't colorblind? I suppose is maybe.
Great question. And see, we have to understand that the way the dilemma is often articulated to us is still a part of the dilemma. So let's come back to the image I just drew. So inside a world in which the realities of intimacy, the realities of the articulation, again, of the true, the good, the noble, the beautiful, even the fully human, the articulation of all that, if it's inside of the intersubjectivity, the reality of whiteness, then the difficulty is to get people who are white, who have made themselves white in that sense, to see that they're actually inside something that's been created. And so the thought of getting beyond is already incredibly problematic, because inside it's not being seen, right? So the reality of it is not being seen. So it's like those old black and white movies, and the ways in which they presented the world, and then every once in a while you would have that non-white person show up at the very edges of it, at the very edges of the screen, as it were, and then they would exit, and then but what you're seeing is the reality of a reality of intimacy that's never articulated as white. It's articulated just as intimacy, and it's evaluated just that way, right? The long struggle we've had over the artistic evaluation of art. And so, the Academy Awards, a constant struggle, because the vision of the true, the good, the beautiful, the honorable, the fully human, imagine, as somehow distilled away from the particulars of existence, and can be isolated just in the way an actor gestures, the way she moves her head, the way she the way in which she carries out her craft. But so what's required is not a getting beyond. What's required are two things. First, story. We have to narrate the thing. It has to be told. So the kind of thing I'm saying right now, this is what has to be put on the table. That we're inside a long history of white, not just white intimacy, but white controlling intimacy, a form of intimacy that always wants to stay centered and to control the conditions by which we imagine life together. And so the first thing to do is to narrate that reality, call it out, show it. And then let's stick with that image of those folks entering stage left. But instead of imagining these non-white folks entering stage left, let's imagine them like sort of like people on a stage. As they are pushing in, they're actually collapsing the stage. They're collapsing all the backdrops. Also, they're pulling up all the lights, and they're continuing just to collapse it. And the other, and the people who are here on the stage is, oh wait, they said, no, you just need to get off. You don't have to leave the stage, but get out of the image that you are in anything other than a stage. And so they keep collapsing it, and then they tell people, okay, step out of it now. Step over here with the rest of us. Now, you're not the center. We're in this together. And so what will then be the currency of our life together? It will be the currency of shared desire and honesty and vulnerability. That's what will be. But that centered existence that was there, that you imagined I get to come in and we get to get beyond race. No, that's gone because I've just collapsed the entire stage. And so what is present? First is the story. And then second is the collapsing of the desire for a centered existence. This is always where the problem is, Matt. Because to be shaped inside of whiteness in the West is to be shaped inside a sense of comfort, safety, and normalcy in centered existence. That things have to revolve around you. And that it's some kind of Herculean or religiously heroic effort for you to decenter yourself. And so what has to be challenged is that very idea of centered existence. Now, and it's not just an idea, it's a reality of a sense of comfort, as I said, a sense of what's normal, and a sense of what is safe. And those realities are not just in the head. They are registered socially, economically, intellectually, academically, and especially geographically, especially in the way communities are shaped. Communities in the West, especially in this country, are shaped in whiteness.
And that actually leads to a question I wanted to get at. That's a major theme in your work, is this idea of place. What does it mean now, either now or what are the ways that we are trained to that we've been trained to relate to place, and what might that mean for students, say at the University of Chicago, or wherever we are?
This is one of the most difficult things, I think, for some people to get their minds around. So especially for those who are Christians, we have a distorted view of creation. We have a distorted sense of what it means to inhabit place. To try to put it as succinctly as I can, for the vast majority of us, not everyone, because there are many indigenous Christians and others who are press against this, but for many in the West, and especially many Christians, we have inculcated we have been deeply habituated into what I call an unrelenting reality of displacement, which means that where we are in terms of how we understand ourselves, how we understand our connectivity, how we understand our relationality and the ethic of relationality that should go with it, is inconsequential to place. So for most of us, one place is just as good as another place. For so many of us, you could pick us up and drop us off anywhere else in the world. If we have a Starbucks and we have a McDonald's, post-pandemic, that is, you can drop us anywhere. And in terms of how we understand ourselves, the reality of the place, the particular configuration of the land, the trees, the birds, the animals, the water, the air, all of that, one place goes another. Now, of course, here's what we have to understand, that this is not just a matter of a kind of historical accident. This is part of the trajectory of displacing people from land and turning all land into private property. This is part of the trajectory of a particular way of understanding life. And let's come to the academic, the intellectual life in a way that is completely displaced. This is why most universities in this country exist in bubbles. They exist in profound bubbles in which they are a self-contained world. And the world outside that university is positioned as their servants. They come in to service and then leave. And then come in to entertain and then leave. And those in the university go out to experiment, go out to in a sense, play with their objects and their subjects, and then return. Now, and the reality of it is that all Western intellectual life is inside that particular configuration of displacement. Now, of course, the implications for where we are now are immense, and I've talked about this in many contexts, but let me just lay out a couple that I think are so important for those listening here to understand. So, as I said earlier, we exist inside not only the racial configuration of existence, but the racial configuration of place. We're inside a racial geography in which the flows of goods and services and opportunities flow around white bodies first, and then you can consider 3 or 4 different kinds of mapping. They extend out from that to others, or they do a circuit around a few others and then back to their main source of energy, white bodies. But all of that continues to be centered around white bodies. And so the difficulty is to get people to understand the placement reality of white supremacy, the placement reality of racial antagonism. That it's not a matter of people's personal behaviors and people liking or not liking. It is structured into the very ground itself. Now, another thing that we all are inside of right now, and that's the reality of governance and policing. All of it, as it is now constituted, is constituted to sustain that very way of being. I've said this many times, but and those of you who've heard me before have said this, but those who are new, I want to make sure you hear this. All policing practice follows zoning policy. Every student listening must never forget what I just said. All policing practice follows zoning policy. You will not change policing practice until you change zoning policy. Because in the case of Black and brown bodies, most of those killed at the hands of police were either in some place they were not supposed to be, according to the racial geography, or the police found themselves in a place where they considered themselves on hostile territory. And so the very place itself heightened their body, drew their body into the pedagogy of violence that is a part of being in that place as police. And so we have to understand that all of our efforts at changing the social fabric of this country must begin with changing the geographic fabric. And trust me, as I'm doing my work these days, that's where the real fight is. People will not fight you at all when you say we need to learn to love each other. People will fight you tooth and nail when they say that the configuration of real estate must show how we love one another. That they will not put up with.
This conversation is rich and generates a lot of questions that I want to follow up on. But I think this is a good time to invite Sydney to help us transition to our time with some of our student panelists to participate in this conversation. And I'm eager to follow the direction that it goes from there. I don't know if Sid, yep, there she is.
Hello, yeah, thanks, Matt. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennings. That was great.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so we're going, like Matt said, we're going to move now into a time of Q&A. These questions will come from a few different student participants we have, as well as the questions that you all are putting on Slido. So please continue to do that. The link is in the chat that you can submit questions, and we'll be continually checking those and bringing those to Dr. Jennings. So I actually get to ask the first question. I'm really excited to ask this. And so my question is on this idea of wholeness and getting to wholeness. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot, even just in the last week with the trial and conviction of Derek Chauvin, and just seeing kind of small pieces of justice while still so much brokenness and injustice exists. So I'm wondering, what is your vision for wholeness in America? And with that, what would it look like? But also, how do we get there?
That's a great question. Thank you, Sydney, for that question. You know, I believe wholeness begins with being able to inhabit fully, wholly, the story of America and the story of the West. And this is the difficulty for us. And those of us inside of education, this is the place where we mourn so much, because so many people in this country have been given harmless history. They have been shaped inside harmless history. And the problem there is that because people haven't been given a full, rich sense of the glory and the horror of the Western world and of this country, it means that they're operating in very small slices of the reality of their own life. And so wholeness begins by us starting to see the full picture. So for example, let's take the state of Minnesota, and let's take Minneapolis. So and I don't know what's going on right now in terms of the school system, but I can guarantee it's probably like so many other school systems. And that is, where are students, where are young people being taught the full history of that city and of that state? Where are they being brought into the long story of land takeover and land seizure and the configuration of neighborhoods and the keeping out of various people and the pushing of people over here and the not letting Black people over there and the redlining? Where have they been taught that? And in most cases, if you've been to school in most parts of this country, whether it's private or public, you aren't taught any of that. And so when people arrive to college, they arrive also with a very thin, very small sense of the long history of racial struggle, not just the struggle for civil rights, but the struggle that is the struggle in whiteness, the struggle of whiteness, the struggle of a particular kind of formation and conformity to a way of being. And so wholeness begins with knowing that story, because without that full story, we really don't know what to do. We're just hoping and wishing, you know, and for so many people, it comes down to, I just wish we could like each other. I just wish we could be friends with each other. That's okay. You know, or we need some new policies. Okay, that's good too. But do you understand where you are, right? So let's use another example here. So to be a part of a family in which you sense yourself at home, what's crucial to that sensing of yourself fully inside of a family is that you know the family's story. And you can locate yourself in the long line of the family story. You see the fabric of the family on your own body, and and then that way you know how to move forward. But here's the problem for so many people in this country: they're not even able to see the fabric. They're not even able to see the effect of the reality of America on their bodies. And I don't just mean in terms of the African American community that knows the long history of racial violence, but the configuration that is America itself. And so that's where wholeness has to begin. But then the next step, and I'll stop here, but then the next step is that there has to be a new reality of intentionality, a new intentionality about how we will configure habitation. And Sydney, this is very important. What we don't need are people saying it would be great if white and non-white people could learn to live together. That's a useless statement. What would be a better statement? It'd be great if we could configure neighborhoods, configure cities, configure so-called suburbs, configure so-called rural areas so that peoples who are not living together, are not living in the vicinity of each other, can live together. It would be great if we said the first thing we have to do for wholeness is we have to ban all gated communities. There should not be any gated communities. It should be illegal to have a gated community. And also, if you're going to have paid police to guard your gated communities, they can't have any weapon. That's where it would start in order to get wholeness.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's awesome. So our next question is coming from Ben. So Ben, go ahead and join us.
Hello. Hello, everyone. How you doing, Dr. Jennings?
Great to see you, Ben.
Great to see you. So I'm part of OBS. I'm a third year studying psychology and comparative human development. But today I mostly speak from my own experience and my own curiosities. I grew up in a Christian household. But I was listening to you speak, and I'm still digesting a lot of what you were saying. It's very dense information. But one thing you were saying, the analogy that really stuck to me was you're talking about how when Europeans came over to this country, their relationship with theology and God was partly based on their relationship with the land. They saw land, they had power, control, and greed. So it kind of shaped their relationship with God, because God in that era was saying, I gave this to you. This is for you. So I think something that I've always been curious about, and something that I'd really like to hear you speak about, is on the other side, how as a Black people, we were introduced to Christianity in such a way where it was the opposite. Like, we were not in control. We were slaves at the time. And I'm just wondering, because Christianity is tied with whiteness and it contributes to each other, how has Christianity evolved over time? And what have Black people done to bring the whiteness out of Christianity? And are we there at the perfect form of Christianity for Black people, or is it still evolving?
That's a great question, Benjamin. And I tell you, I would say in a certain way, it's still maybe not evolving, but still struggling to come to be. But here's what we want to keep in mind. So as what we would now call Europeans come to many places in the sub-Saharan parts of Africa, they're encountering not people who are not religious. They're encountering people who are very religious, their own indigenous religions, there Islam, and there are Christians. So there are some who would be slaves that were already Christian, and so they're encountering all of this. But for those coming to the new worlds, they were being confronted with what was for anyone the most difficult way in which to think a religion, to think a reality of faith. So very briefly, there were three responses to the Christianity that was being presented to them by the colonialists. The first response of the Africans was, this is a bunch of crap. This is a bunch of ridiculous crap. And there's no way I'm going to listen or believe any of it. It's a bunch of crap. The second response was, they said, okay, I believe. You see the way I have my hands? They said, I believe, because they were saying that because a knife or a gun was pointed at their heads. Oh, yes, I believe. Yes, I believe. Yeah, I believe in Jesus. Yes, of course. Yes, the triune God. Yes, of course. So they would say, I believe, but in terms of their own life, when they could be by themselves, when they could think their own thoughts, they never left their indigenous and native ways of life and forms of faith and forms of religion. In fact, they used Christianity as a kind of foil. It was just a kind of covering underneath. They would have their own realities. Now, and of course, for some, a little bit of that would trickle in, and they would do a kind of interesting bricolage. There's an interesting mixture, but in point of fact, they're not trying to be Christian like their colonial masters. That's the second response. The third response, Benjamin, is that there are some who become Christian. They become Christian. And in this third response, we have to have an A and we have to have a B. The A group hears the words of the colonialist, gains the education of the colonial masters, and fully assimilates. They say, yes, your way of seeing God, yes, your way of describing yourself and me, yes to everything. I will be you. I will be you to the greatest extent that I can be. That's the A group. And the A group receives fully into itself the beauty of the European, the beauty of whiteness, and a derogatory view of their own selves. And they are Christian. But then there's a B group. And the B group says, there is some truth here, but the person offering it is not true. And what I have to do is tease out the truth here and start to reinterpret what these people are giving me, so that it makes sense to who I understand God to be and who I understand myself to be. There are some things that they're saying that are clearly true, but there are many things that they're saying that are not. And so this 3B group redefines, in a sense, recreates the Christianity. It becomes Black Christianity, it becomes Afro diaspora Christianity, it becomes a Christianity that looks and aligns with the reality of their lives and their vision of who God is. Now, here's what's crucial. Benjamin. You're going to hold on to this. All those groups, not one of them, that's not a historical evolution. All of those groups existed. And Benjamin, today, in every Black community, in every part of the world, all of those groups yet exist. All of those groups yet exist. Sometimes they exist in the same community. Sometimes they exist in the same church. Sometimes they exist in the same family. And sometimes they even exist in the same person. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, the person like, oh, this is a bunch of crap. Tuesday, Thursday, yeah, I think I can believe. Then Saturday and Sunday, yes, I'm a serious Christian. Then Monday comes, oh, this is a bunch of crap. So, so what does that mean? It means that all of it is an ongoing negotiation with two things. It's a negotiation with a white Christianity that constantly, they can sense the hegemonic, the horrible energy of it pressing against them. So they're pushing against that white Christianity. And then the other, they're trying to tease out a vision of love of God and love of self that is freed from the derogatory, horrible, assimilationist logic of white Christianity. And so they're trying to figure that out. But they're in conversation with all these others, right? So many of the conversations about faith, about religion, about Christianity in the Black community, if people don't understand that they're inside this long trajectory, they misidentify things. So when someone tells me, I'm an atheist, I don't believe, I say, well, welcome home. That's always been a part of it. When someone says to me, well, I'm not sure I think Christianity is the best faith for me. I think, a little bit of this, I said, okay, well, welcome home. That's been a part of this as well. So all of that is present. Now, of course, the challenge is for those who are a part of that 3B group, the challenge is to see clearly the ongoing work of trying to define a Christianity, articulate a Christianity that continues to spy out what was good, what was great in the gospel message, and do that while pulling from that message all this other derogatory. Now, let me just say, what I've just described for the African diaspora people can be repeated for Native American peoples in this country, can be repeated for so many other indigenous peoples all over the world. That same struggle, right? So it's an ongoing work, but it's a beautiful work, Benjamin, a beautiful work.
Thank you so much. That actually enlightened a lot of things for me. I really appreciate the fact you said it's always been that way, because I feel like I myself have thought that I'm special for being in a certain category.
You are special, my brother. You are special, but you're inside of a long history of special people, man.
I appreciate it. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I think we have to move on. So thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah, I'm actually going to take a follow-up question that is coming from the Slido, and it's on this subject similarly. And someone's asking, can you speak on place, your idea of place for folks who experience diaspora? What is place supposed to mean to them?
And you said for folks who experience what? I didn't catch it.
Diaspora.
Great question. So what place has always been across this planet? Place has always been a call, a invitation to connect. The language I use theologically is to join. So, the idea of nomadic people is always misunderstood, because when people talk about nomadic people, they think they're talking about people who are placeless, but that is the furthest thing from the truth. Nomadic people are people intensely tied to place. They follow the language, they follow the pattern of the place, so that they know that they follow their animal kin to where they will be grazing next. They follow the pattern of growth and harvest and decay. And so they go from one place where this particular set of plants is blooming, and soon we will move here to this particular group of plants. They follow the water. Soon the salmon will be coming, and we will go here, and then we will follow them there, so that they are attuned to the land. So place is the reality that is always there to call us home. And by home, I mean to call us back into a deeper connection. Now, here's what's crucial. Place is so important because our sense of connectivity is crucial to whatever quality of relationality we have, right? If I believe that we are all connected by this place, then it already starts to suggest to me ways of relating that honor the place we're all connected to. It's like being on a boat, Sydney. So if I'm on a boat and we're all out in the middle of the ocean, and you start to jump up and down and say, hey, Sydney, let's sit back down. Let's sit back down because we're in this together. You can't, no, you can't. No, don't lean over that way because this is a small boat. Stay right where you are. That sense of connection is crucial. And the problem is, for so many of us, we've been robbed of the importance of place. And by that, I mean, we've been robbed of the importance of seeking connection to place and opening our senses and our reality of discernment to the realities of place.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. The next question is coming from Christina. So Christina, go ahead and join us, please.
Hello, my name is Christina. Thank you for speaking with us today, Dr. Jennings. I'm a third year at the college studying molecular engineering, and I'm with the Catholic Students Association. And my question for you is, at the end of your talk, I believe that you mentioned that white supremacy is built into the very structure of our country and it sustains our very way of being. And that in order to make any real change, we have to change the geographic fabric. So in an earlier response to Sydney's question, you mentioned about the removal of gated communities and armed private police at those communities. As for the physical real estate itself, what do you think that restructuring would look like in the short term, perhaps 5 to 10 years time, or in the long term?
It would, in the short term, it would be the great unveiling, Christina, the great unveiling. What do I mean by that? In the short term, it would mean for the first time, probably in the history of most communities, everybody who is making the decisions about real estate, about development, about where buildings will go, about how much houses will cost, where apartments will be, where all those decisions will be not only democratized, but completely opened to everyone to see. And a process of shared governance will be created where everyday people will say, oh, hold on. I don't think it's a good idea to build, this subdivision with homes that start at $700,000. That's not a good idea for us. Now, that would require an incredible struggle because there are vested interests all around us, and there are global interests right now that's the last thing they want. Right now in this world, huge sectors of this planet are controlled by a few people in terms of real estate. And there are people who don't live anywhere near where we live who are making decisions about what happens in our neighborhoods. And by that, I'm not trying to evoke a new kind of nativism or a provinciality and control, but it's the reality that in the short term, what has to happen is that all the decisions about place need to be made public, really made public, and slowed down so that no decisions are made that affect anyone without their involvement. Now, what that would then mean, moving from the short term to the long term, is that we would want to create a set of standards, create a moral compass for the creation of habitation that does not exist in this world anywhere. What drives habitation is capitalism, pure and simple. And so we need a moral compass to drive capitalism and a moral compass to drive that. So what would that mean? Moving from the short term to the long term, we would say that no city, no town, no community may have people without homes. Homelessness is illegal, not illegal for the person, but illegal for any community. You have to house people. No one is to be on the street. No one is to be without shelter. And that requires the fundamental reconfiguration of space. Now, moving to the long term, we'd have to start to think about reconfiguring habitation. The idea of the suburb as opposed to the city, the idea of rural as opposed to urban, are beautiful fictions created by particular configurations of not only of property and of land, but of transportation, of the flows of bodies and goods and services. And we have to challenge all of that. We have to challenge the way in which municipalities have created themselves and continue to structure themselves in ways that are always detrimental to those who are poor and without voice.
Thank you. Thank you for your response to the question. I just have one quick follow-up on that. So in the short term, you mentioned that, okay, there's like this very small group of people who may not even live where the native people are making decisions. And in order to make that restructuring that is necessary, how do you suggest we have those conversations with those few people? Or like, what does discourse look like in order to kind of show, I guess, as you mentioned earlier, like the story, talk about the story that's necessary. What does that look like? And how does, I guess, the individual, like one of us maybe, play a part in that?
Oh, that's a great question. And for those like you are at a university, you are right at the place where it has to happen, right? So you start with all those people who are at the university who do urban studies, urban planning, architecture, all the people on the campus who know who the people are out there who are making those decisions, and many times are working with them. And you as students demand, we want meetings. We want to know what's going on. We want to understand. And then what happens in every community is that there are those required kind of public hearings that happen regularly, that in which city officials have to tell the wider community what plans are in the works. And oftentimes those meetings are poorly attended. And there's a few activists trying to get more people to come, but folks are so busy. So the ability to educate yourself is really easy because you're at a major university. So all you have to do now, and your university is well known for having really significant intellectuals who understand the shape of not only the urban landscape, but the configuration, the anatomy of the way property flow and property acquisition and accumulation happens. And so you get those people in front of you, have them explain things to you, and then say, okay, where are the levers of power in terms of, and of course, in Chicago, you have the great laboratory, probably one of the, other than maybe Los Angeles, it's one of the greatest laboratories in all these problems that I've just mentioned. Chicago has a long and profound history of geographic racial struggle. And so what you must do is everyone must, first of all, educate themselves on that history, and then see at this very moment the pressure points. There's a interesting history about the racial configuration of the Chicago suburbs. There's a great book by a guy named George Lipsick called where's that book at? I'll find it, but it's called How Race Takes Place. And in part of that book, he tells a wonderful story. It's not really a wonderful story, but it's a powerful story about when Martin Luther King did a march about poverty and segregation there in Chicago, and the vicious response that he got. And he said that what he'd experienced in Chicago was worse than anything he had seen in the South. And that's saying a lot.
Great, thank you so much.
You're more than welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we're gonna move to the next student participant, which is Kwabene. So Kwabene, please join us.
Hello, Dr. Jennings. Thank you again for speaking with us today. My name is Kwabene Kalambula. I am a third-year undergrad. I'm studying sociology here in the college. I'm also co-president of the University Ministry of Christ Church Chicago. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. I come from a place where I very much would like to see reconciliation happen. And we talk a lot about like just brokenness with just from the very start of our nation, from the Christianity, which, I'm called by Jesus to love the church, but I see the church is fractured, right? So we're talking about you talk about how the concept of race is intertwined with Christianity. It originates from it, as well as, the pain that has been derived from some beliefs and practices. This history is all intertwined. And you talk a lot about how some of the processes of fixing this involve like reevaluating our history, both in this country, looking at that, taking that seriously, as well as Christianity. And I think you and I both agree that, the Christianity that results in this pain is a distorted view of Christianity where, we hear, for God so loved the world, not for God so loved just this one people. We hear there's no longer Jew nor Greek. Not that these distinctions are meaningless, but that we're one through Christ. and that like is able to supersede these things. Yet, you know, we keep getting in our own way, I think, of bringing this about. So my question is just kind of like, what kind of actions, what kind of thought processes can we adopt? Can we start enacting to kind of look at these shared histories, this shared history of the U.S., of Christianity's distortion, and also kind of how can we take some corrective action through conversations? What are some practical action steps we can take as individuals and as the American church to reevaluate some of these things and to bring people on the same page?
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great question. You know, and I've said this before, so I don't want to press anybody's patience by me repeating myself a little bit. But I think what's really important is introducing Christians in the West to their story. Kobene, listen, the reality of it is that so many Christians in the West don't know their own story. And that is to say, as I mentioned earlier, that we were Gentiles brought into another people's story. Now, what's supposed to come with that is a sense of humility, a sense of what it meant to be at the margins and brought inside by grace through love, right? We are there inside the story, not to take it over, but because we love one of their own, one of Israel's own. And so we're inside, you know, it's like being invited to somebody's house who you love, and you be introduced to the family and you hope they will accept you, but you're there in vulnerability because you this is not yours, but you are there hoping to be a part. Now, the feeling, the sense of vulnerability, the sense of gratefulness for having been brought inside, it is a sense that most Christians in the West are formed without any of that. So no sense of the marginality, no sense of the vulnerability, no sense of what it means to be an outsider. Now, so think about it this way, my dear brother. What if we had all been inculcated after centuries habituated in this deep sense of humility, this deep sense of what it means to enter into another people? And what if we had been cultivated over the centuries in the ability of how to enter into the lives of other peoples without trying to take their lives over or losing ourselves? What would it have been like? And see, that's the problem with the word assimilation as we understand it, that we can't imagine a possibility of entering into the lives of others, entering into ways of life, entering into other people's stories without either taking it over or losing ourselves. And so where we should begin individually and collectively is the church being reintroduced to the story of what it means to be a Christian, the constant entering in, the constant joining, the constant becoming a part of other people's for the sake of love. And through that, to give witness, perform a reality of joining. That's where we want to begin, especially with Christians, because for so many Christians, their vision of what it means to think about reconciliation is they imagine themselves as centered hosts. I'm going to allow you to come into my home, sit at my table, and come and be a part of what I'm doing here. And that's already messed up from the very beginning, because that very vision already blinds you to the reality of what it means to be a Christian. We are the ones that Peter spoke to and said, why am I here? Why am I talking to you? And then we are the ones that then Peter then said, God has showed me that I have to look at you differently, because up to now, God told me not to even notice you. Wow. That's where Christianity begins. Now, unfortunately, for so many Christians, they imagine themselves Peter doing the talking. And all manner of problem comes out when you start. Eventually, we want to see ourselves as Peter, but not at that moment.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I couldn't unmute my microphone for a second. But thank you very much for sharing this. This is a beautiful picture. This process of continually entering in. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're more than welcome. You're more than welcome, my dear brother.
Yeah, okay, we're gonna do one final question. This is coming from the Slido. And it's this: did the belief that Jesus was the only path to heaven inevitably lead to colonial racism? Is there a path to wholeness that holds on to that belief? And if so, how would that look?
That's a great question. So here we want to always situate the idea of Jesus's life inside of the life of Israel, and not extract it out and weaponize it as a litmus test to who God allows in or out. That's already a distortion. To put it in the way that is Jesus the only way is already a terrible way to put it. I mean, you've already the person, not the person who asked the question, but that way of thinking is already, in a sense, commodified Jesus, weaponized Jesus. So let's think about it this way. Christianity was itself a profound surprise to Jew and Gentile alike, a profound surprise. And what was that surprise? That God loves them too. Jewish believers of Jesus, seeing that God desired the Gentile as deeply as God desired them. Gentiles seeing that the God of Israel desired them as much as that God desires that God's own people. And that desire is meant to be shared. So now, let's play with that bad question. Is Jesus the only way? And let's turn on its head. Let's ask this question. Is there another way to build that deep reality of desire and touching between people who have been enemies, who imagine that their lives are better apart from each other? Is there a way to, I'm not talking about tolerance, make sure they just don't kill each other now, but if I'm going to talk about, no, I want them to join. I want them to love each other. So here's what the question we want to ask. Is Jesus the way to that? And the answer for Christians is that's exactly right. We are called Christians because Jesus is making that happen. Now, if you want to ask the question, well, is he the only? Well, nobody's asking that question. I mean, you could ask that question, but that's kind of missing the point. The point is, do you want to see the surprise in this world? And the surprise is people who hate each other, people who are enemies, people who despise each other, people who never trust each other, based in this new reality of the Spirit of God, we believe, are being drawn not just to tolerate each other again, but to love each other. At that moment, now we have in front of us the very reason for Jesus. The very reason for Jesus is that Jesus gives witness to the claim of God on all of us at the site of joining, not this kind of individual, me and Jesus, me and God. That's foolish. There is an individual element there, but what's the first reality is that Jew and Gentile, and then multiple Gentiles. And by Gentile, we simply mean all those who are not Jews. So Gentile is just not one group, it's all the rest of the planet, the multiple peoples, all of them being joined to Israel and joined to each other. And at the site that is at the body and the way of life and the reality of Jesus's life of love and worship of God. So in that regard, we are saying that we have found that this is a compelling way to see what we never thought was possible. Enemies becoming friends. People who fear and would never trust each other, coming to love one another without conquering, without submerging who they are, but fully who they are, coming together to create, as the New Testament says, one new human.
Right. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're unfortunately out of time for questions, but I'm going to invite Matt Vega back with us.
Thank you, Sydney. Dr. Jennings, I am in awe of your charity, your wisdom, and not least important, your stamina. This has been a whole hour and a half of just us throwing questions in your direction, and you have been so gracious to teach us. You brought us so much for us to carry back with us in our homes, in our classrooms, elsewhere. And so I want to say thank you to you for that. I am a student of yours, and we all became students of yours today. And I want to say thank you to all of the student panelists, to Sydney, to all our guests, and all those who helped make this event possible. And I'm gonna turn it over to Sydney to share one final word on of gratitude and on logistics and any other logistical remarks.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, we want to thank you also, Matt Vega, for moderating this. You did a wonderful job, brought great questions. So thanks so much for that. And of course, thank you, Dr. Jennings, just for your wisdom on this topic. I really enjoyed the conversation. I know you guys did too. On Slido, there were a ton of questions we didn't get to. So we would really like you guys to fill out the survey that you can find on Slido, and on that there was an option to let us know if you're interested in a discussion happening sometime after this. So please fill that out. You'll be entered if you fill it out into a drawing for a $50 gift certificate to Seminary Co-op Bookstore. So that's really exciting. We just really want to hear your feedback on tonight's forum and be able to connect you with resources to follow up on this topic. Finally, I also want to thank our wonderful co-sponsors for making this event possible, and to all of you for attending and being a part of this conversation. So thank you, Matt. Thank you, Dr. Jennings. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening. Thanks, guys.
You too. Thank you all.